I think I do, yeah. We gotta kick in, there it is. Good evening. I think it's there. Good evening. We'll be continuing with class this evening after like 4 weeks, I think, something like that. We had just kicked off the translation portion and talked about textual criticism, yada, yada, that kind of thing. Not meant to be a negative, just the process by which texts are evaluated and looked at, and that the Bible stands up to scrutiny with impressively, amazingly flying colors, even in comparison with other classic works that people teach authoritatively. This evening, we're going to be talking kind of about the underlying translation methods to kind of set up our look at some of the English translations, which is kind of wind out everything. We'll have the last two basically are going to be part one and part two of English translations to kind of lay them out. But as I said a few times, and as we started translation, this is the piece where it's more in man's hands. God has taken care of everything to this point and has providentially provided us with a lot of tools. But there are no perfect translations. Even what they had in the first century, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, was imperfect, but they were able to use it. And on the one hand, there are definitely better translations than not. You can still teach a lot of truth from even a poor translation. What we're going to talk about today is kind of the methodology, the philosophy, it's going to come down to the brain, the focus, the attitude you have, and how you approach how you're going to make a translation is going to kind of demonstrate how well it's going to turn out. And unfortunately, there's been kind of a shift in thinking in the last 2 generations or so of how to approach translating these texts. And that can present an issue. Translation philosophy. Really, there are three, in the modern English form, 3 different categories, and read this as 2. I'm going to spoil something. The third technically isn't a translation philosophy at all. A paraphrase isn't that? So we're going to focus heavily on the first 2. I'm going to try not to be too dry about these particular things and just to explain there's a different approach in thought, and it kind of changed, not to blame the New International Version of 1978, 1982, but that's around the time when the shift in approach to how to render a text started to shift. And some people ran with it to some crazy areas, some not so much. Okay? The first of these is what would be known as formal equivalence. Frankly, this is how translations had been done forever. This is pretty much the way they generally were done. The philosophy, the idea, the perspective, whatever term you want to use, wants the most literal translation possible by expressing into English, in our case, or the target language, the original language coming from the other in a word-by-word methodology. Well, duh, that's what you're going to do, right? This word's this, you find its matching word, and you win, you know, it's done, right? It's that simple. When anyone here do any like foreign language credits and various things, I'm sure we all kind of had to some degree. You know how plainly things just go from one language to another, even if they're similar families, like English to German, or even from the Romance languages, English and Spanish, or Spanish and French, they all just line up perfectly, right? And those are Western languages. Try to include some of the like Oriental languages, Japanese or Chinese or Mandarin, or those, they just line up perfectly, right? They don't. So when you're striving for the word-by-word methodology, that is the high goal. Frankly, what you're going to end up with is a balancing act between readability and literalness. Think that this would be the way to go. There are some major advantages. It renders a translation closest to the original text because you're using words mean things. Words mean things. If you use words, and I'm going to kind of give something away about the new philosophy, but I will talk a little more about what it means to kind of compare with this. The newer form tends to focus more on ideas rather than words, which is dangerous. Words express thought. Do words change their meaning over time? Yes. But since we were able to capture in the original time period, there's a lot of third-party sources that point out all these things, we can know what words meant in its time for the New Testament Greek, Common Greek, Koine Greek, and for Biblical Hebrew. We can take that word and carry it forward. Of course, we cheat. We make up new words. We don't want to carry cross meaning. But if you're following this form, it sounds great. How could anything ever possibly go wrong by trying to be as literal as possible? Well, where do you think we end up? There are some key problems you run into with formal equivalence taken to the nth degree. Number one, the problem of readability. I'm going to put something up here. That is John 3:16. I'm going to embiggen it a little bit. Well, I can only go to the edge of the browser. Looks familiar, right? Thus, for he loved the God of the world, so that the Son, the only begotten he gave, in order that ever the one believing unto him he may not be destroyed, but he may have life eternal. Sounds right, right? Like Yoda English. That is a Castle original. That's my translation from the Greek. And you can argue the different fine points of how to render different things. But that is a direct relation thing without any smoothing. And notice it starts to kind of flow very strangely. And to be fair, John's Greek is pretty easily translatable. You do this with some of Paul's writings. He puts a noun at the end of a sentence that's 30 words long, and you're still wondering what he's talking about. Readability, it doesn't translate perfectly. Notice you have the not, he may not be destroyed. That's a double negative. You don't do stuff like that, right? That's wrong. That's grammatically incorrect. Well, in Greek, a double negative is an emphatic. You can get away with saying not, or extra not, double not. No, actually, that's newspeak. Never mind. This is not, I used a familiar verse. You could muddle your way through that. And if you want an example of a translation that is slavishly literal, if you can find it, you can get it for free on like eSword or some of the electronic ones. Young's literal translation, the same Young's that did his analytical concordance. He tried to be as in latter 19th century, like 1890s English, as possible. And sometimes it just hurts. But if you want to get that, Young's literal, and that's why he called it that. It's not something you're going to use every day to study from. Nor is it that easy to anyone out there. And that's going to become an issue. If you're using a translation, it's not just going to be useful for you to find the message, but it has to be something that the person you're trying to reach and study with can at least follow, right? So that's one of the key problems, readability versus literalness, and it's a sliding scale. The second problem is the incongruence of some Greek and English words, which shouldn't surprise anyone. I brought this up before. There isn't a one-to-one ratio on translations. It just doesn't work. Just as I used a German word in the sermon, Schadenfreude, that has no English form, there are some Greek terms that there's debate over how you render them. Famously, you do the right side first. All of these different New Testament words are translated as love. Agape, service love. Phileo, friendship love. Storge, familial love. Eros actually doesn't really show up in the New Testament, but I included it for completeness. Erotic love, you can probably take it from that. There's romantic love, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's what the world would probably use. It's Valentine's Day, it's fine. Charity, that is true. Yeah, the King James would do that. It would use the term charity. But even the problem there is charity has evolved in meaning from 1611. And this is where we're going to get into why you need to modernize translations. English has evolved from 1611, from the King James. Words have changed. Hell used to mean the grave. Now it means torments. I mean, there's a lot of things. But you're right. The King James goes with charity because they were looking for a term that was different than affection, because it's about serving another person. So that's a many-to-one relationship. Love is the most famous one. That's why I picked it. But there are a few like this. One that really kind of frustrates me is epithemia, I think. It doesn't matter. The original word just means strong desire. It has no moral quality to it, yay or nay. It's just strongly desiring something. It can be negative and it can be positive, but translators, in their desire to help, will translate it desire when it's positive and lust when it's negative. Lust is necessarily negative. The original term works either way, and sometimes with the way the translators choose to take things, it can actually change the meaning a little bit of what they're going for, because it can be wrong to strongly desire something that isn't necessarily negative if it comes before God, and I don't know. So that's an example of a one-to-many relationship. An example would be the word pneuma. This one causes a lot of confusion, because it can be translated as wind, breath, or spirit. You get pneumatic tools, pneuma. But the Spirit, pneuma. The Holy Spirit, hagios pneumatikos. Okay, so are we talking about a breeze here? Are we talking about a being? It can go different ways. And then, of course, the King James uses ghost. That just confuses things even further. But that's an example where there are a couple cases where the translator deciding on their own is trying to decide, is this talking about a force, like just a natural pressing force, or is this a spiritual thing? And depending on how they go, it can change the meaning. Another one with spirit is capitalizing spirit versus little spirit. Is this the spiritual person, your spiritual mind, or is this the Holy Spirit? Anyway. We talked about angelos before. It's not on there, but that's messenger or angel, and that can change things a lot. A lot of English words we transliterated. We just made new words. So, those are your biggest issues with formal equivalence. And they're going to be common pitfalls in translation in general. They're nothing really that bad. It's just that's why you'll have the sliding scale of differing versions. What they like to do, if you go to Mardel, they always have like a little handy-dandy little brochure that lists all the translations and then lists their grade levels. If something's at a higher grade level, does that make it automatically better? If something's at a lower grade level, does that make it automatically simpler? Sometimes explaining things takes away the original language. How do I put this calmly? One thing that the NIV created an easy-to-read kid version that was an even lesser one, and they got into trouble because what they wanted to do was to get rid of to make things very plain. So, the Old Testament and New both use, but the Old Testament is where this was found. They use an idiomatic expression for a marriage. Yeah, someone knew his wife. That's in the original text. That's a correct translation. That's the idiom that was used in it. But because that didn't carry over for kids, believe it or not, they tried to better explain what that means by using the explicit term because it made it easier to read. See, it's sliding scale. Sliding scale. I tend to not be scared of higher reading levels because if something is complicated, that doesn't make it bad. But anyway, so that was formal equivalence was how most of the translations, it's on the list there. King James, because that's kind of where we're going to start when we're talking about English versions. There were a couple others before the Bishop's Bible, Tyndale's, and so forth, or covered, I guess it would be Coverdale's. But King James Thread, so the American Standard Version of 1901, which was the American version of the English Revised Bible, whatever. The Revised Standard of 1947, New American Standard of 1977. It was updated in 1995. That's the one I commonly use. It was also updated again in 2020, and not in a good way. I'm kind of annoyed with it. Save that. And then and it doesn't necessarily mean old per se. The English Standard Version of 2001 still follows formal equivalence in terms of they tend to lean more on the easier to read, but still trying to keep with the word to word as literal as possible. However, in the the 70s, they already started playing with this. With the NIV, they kind of began they put their toes in the water with a new translation philosophy, and they called it dynamic equivalence. Dynamic equivalence. Well, if you were to walk up to someone and ask them, how do you think you translate something, they'd probably, stabbing at it, go with the way formal works. You take a word and why would you do it any other way? It's the readability thing. And it's the need to explain, for lack of a better term, from the translator's perspective what it means, and to blunt some language. Dynamic equivalence. This philosophy seeks the expression of the original language through the translation of the original language ideas into English ones. Well, that's not a big deal. What's the difference between, you're taking a concept to a concept. What's the big deal here? How do you translate an idea? Yeah. Subjective opinions. This is where you can start to inject your slant. And it doesn't mean that other translations don't have a slant. The New American Standard that I use is heavily premillennial in its translation, and there's certain things. There's a couple places I've done things. But if it still follows, theoretically, words, even if it rephrases some things and shifts them so they can be read, the words are there. When you start to talk in ideas, it's concepts, and it really comes down to how you want to represent them. And you can start to wander from the original intention really quick. It can be, but it can be more blatant than you think. And I would argue they did this with the 2020 version of the New American Standard. I'll give an example about that when we get to it, of why they did something. Advantages. Difficult wording can be avoided. You can really render an idea in English better if you're not tied down to the specific wording and verbiage, though you're starting to wander into paraphrase territory at that point. But, okay. Frankly, what you'll find is the language tends to get weaker. For instance, the original term that is translated in other translations is propitiation, which is this grand concept of being a once and for all offering for sins above all. It's like this major term becomes something like sacrifice, which doesn't quite have the punch. The original intent may be better expressed by different language or use of words in English. You can probably, idiomatically especially, render it in English in better ways. But you're getting in the way, because there are some disadvantages. When you use this methodology, and again, they were kind of stepping into it. They generally the word by word as best they could with the earlier ones, and then the more they wandered away from formal equivalents with different translations, it got more and more loose. The original language is not being directly translated per se when you do this. You're not actually translating. You are borderline paraphrasing. You really are. And it's going through the filter of whom? Who's the mind that is deciding these things? The translator. Now, if you have a translation committee, now it's going through a committee, and committees always make things better. The NIV, it was 78 for the New Testament, 82 for the Old. It's an interesting look, because it generally it's fine, and there's places where we can go, well, we'll get into it when we kind of look at them, but the weird thing is through committee, one of the translators was a member of the church, and the areas he handled are actually pretty good. It's like one or two books that are actually maybe a little better, but some of the others, it's so hit or miss. Here's the thing, there's usage of language not originally intended by the inspired writer. That should bother you. People are like, oh, well, it's just carrying an idea forward. Well, ideas can be stretched heavily. That's true. That's true. Bible societies have existed for a long time. Translators exist. But just to show how dangerous it can get, okay? It hasn't, in some of these translations, it hasn't happened yet. Baptism still shows up. It's still there. However, if the idea of salvation is to be conveyed and you want to avoid the details of it, you could argue for the removal and just call it washing or use some other general terminology. It's a very dangerous level to where you'll remove something that's a command very quickly. Where does the Lexham English Bible fall into this? I know that a lot of preachers use Logo software. Uh-huh. And that's their online version. They've got a Lexham English Bible. It's not in hard copy. It came out in 2010. What group does that fall into? I'm not really sure. I haven't looked at Logos's one. I can look. I wouldn't be surprised if it was more formal. Logos tends to take, at least as a software, they tend to take Bible study and various things more seriously than other things. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was on more of the formal side. But that, again, I haven't looked at it. I know I have the software. I just tend to use the New American Standard. But I could take a look. But I don't know where it'd fall on that. But that would be my guess. I wouldn't imagine, at least anyone I know, that would. We tend we tend to use the versions we used in school or used our lives. Very few people changed even what they normally used when we were at Bear Valley, unless they were using one that wasn't allowed, for lack of a better term. We had to use, if I remember right, it was King James, New American Standard 1901. If you wanted to hate yourself. I think we're the, and ESV, was ESV allowed? Yeah, but NIV was not. As of 2005, so I don't know. Mm-hmm. Certainly. And one thing about Logos, I'll bring that up, is it really heavily, if you do word studies in it, it heavily emphasizes multiple sources. And it's always a good practice to use an interlinear or something. Check differing translations, especially if you run into something that's odd. Just see how they all render it. You'll start to find patterns, good and bad, between them, but not being wedded to a singular one. And to allay your fears, the software itself throws like every translation it can at you, not just that one, most of the time. Anyway, such a method is really more of an interpretation than translation is the last point. And that's really it. Who's doing the interpreting? It's the translator, and that can be a dangerous thing. Yep. Yeah. Well, knowing where culture is not a bad thing. To become all things to all men, but not letting culture override is the other side. God used culture in his communication. You have to. That's the filter by which certain things can be seen, but it never overrides command. Culture right now, their big push is removing gender from things. That is showing up in Bibles. Speaking of idiomatic, that was my first issue with the 2020 edition of the New American Standard Bible. In terms of idea translation versus formal, it was in 2 Peter 3, 16 and 17, where I'm used to, the Word of God, or all Scripture is inspired, and so forth. In verse 17, it says, so that the man of God may be equipped for every good work. They have made it now man or woman of God. The general principle is fine, but the context is dealing with not just Christians, but evangelists. And so you can see kind of where the direction is heading to go, to take away the big target in the New Testament are Paul's teachings on male leadership and the order of the church. Always have been for a long time. Idiomatically, you can carry forward some of these concepts, for instance, to where it's talking about persons, not males. It's talking about servants. It starts there and starts to break down, and it starts to show up in the text and then down the line. The thing is you can make an argument that, well, it's perfectly fine as an idea generally, but it's usually a subtle thing, and it starts to work its way down. A more like famous, I don't know, I'd probably save that for when we look at the NIV, but Psalm 51, where the original rendering is, "In sin did my mother conceive me," which poetically, he's speaking hyperbolically. He's been sinful his entire existence. He hasn't been, but it's when he's broken. The NIV takes that to become, "I have been sinful from birth," which is not what it says, but it fits well with the original sin. The idea, yeah. Translations. Dynamic equivalence, you need to be aware, is the most popular translation philosophy. All of the new ones, well, not all, the majority of the new versions that come out follow the dynamic equivalence model. They also use a particular text, the eclectic text, but that's deeper in the weeds than we really need to get into. The third philosophy, then, technically, but I only have one slide for it because the Phillips translation in the 60s, the Message, and which has been remade every 10 years because it goes out of style. The Message from the 90s sounds such like a 90s production. Anyone familiar with the Message, that paraphrase? Oh, man. Woo! That's some weird stuff. Jamie and I were at a Bible camp one time where they had a speaker through the whole week, which is kind of unusual. But okay, so he was teaching on Job. And he decided to teach Job out of the Message the entire week, which was insane. And you'd run into like conversations where Job is complaining to God and it'd be, "Let's not make a federal case out of this, okay?" Stuff like that. And you're like, what? I was trying to use colloquial expressions. With poetry, it might work, but not really. And with doctrine, scary stuff. It's all just some guy. It's just one guy's opinion. Phillips was the same thing. A paraphrase is just a restatement of a text, a passage, or a work, giving the meaning in another form. It's a fancy way of saying, putting it in your own words. That's not a translation. That's putting it in your own words. And honestly, they're not working from the original. They're usually working from another English text because they have to have a baseline from which to create their idioms. The Living Bible is another one. Now, here's the thing. Do you know who paid for the Living Bible? Lockman Foundation. You know who published the New American Standard? The Lockman Foundation. In 1977, even though the New American Standard Bible was, lack of a term, conservative, in its time, and is considered extra conservative now because time has passed, it was attacked, especially by brethren. You can't use that new liberal translation because that same foundation made the Living Bible. That was their logic. I guess. I don't know. But yeah, you're right. The Living Bible was another one, another paraphrase. There's the Reader's Digest Bible that condenses the Bible. You want your Bible to be condensed and have certain parts removed, right? What do they do with numbers? It's like one line. People got counted, Because of the flow of history, there's going to be, there's a couple more elements to get into here, but these things are basically the things I'm focusing upon this evening, and we might wind a little earlier than we do, because, again, this is basically information, and I could dig in so far, and it's trying to figure out how far to go. There are two schools that are the basis between the different Bible texts and what they'll use. Because of the flow of history, the vast number of manuscripts which are in existence come from a relatively late date. There are more copies from a later time because copies upon copies upon copies, and we have copies, and the ones that we have. We don't have that many from the 300s. We have a lot from like the 600s and 700s. This leads to two different schools of thought. There's the majority text thought. The more is better. Let's go with the ones we have the most of. There's the age of evidence is better philosophy. Older is better, which is the critical text, is what that's called. And those will be the basis underneath the different Bibles we have. That's another element that comes into play. The King James is based upon the received text, which goes back to the Textus Receptus. There's all this history. It's not that important. But we have basically end up with two threads. The King James thread to the New King James, basically. And you got the American Standard to the Revised Standard to the New American Standard to the ESV. And that's why you'll have some differences with the King James having some more verses that the others don't. The more critical texts don't keep the ones that aren't in the early stuff. 1 John 5, 7, 8 comes into play. There's a verse or two in Acts and here and there. And there's been fights over those two things. Everyone here is kind of like, you want to get into like preacher nerd fights. It's over this kind of stuff. We fought over these kind of, the majority text versus the critical text. You know, I think the critical text is a better apparatus. It's the Greek. There's the other one. It's a whole thing, guys. You're all like, sure. No, really, it's a thing. There is a section of that library where you will find 800-page tomes on the differences between these texts, okay? So someone came along and thought, can't we all just get along? And they took the critical text. They took the majority text. So this is this thread, leading kind of the American Standard, New American Standard. This thread, King James, New King James, bros. They're doing their thing. And they're like, let's just take both of them, mix together something that everyone hates, and call it the eclectic text, which is the compromise, which is the basis of the NIV and some of its thread. They please nobody. This is all the underlying Greek behind them for the New Testament. The Old Testament is its own there aren't as many forms. This is for the New Testament specifically. Do you want to know more about that? Because I'm giving you like the postage stamp of it. Grover? Yeah, that's probably the best way to be. But believe me. And again, there were some that were like these new translations use this inferior text. This is the text that has been used since Erasmus, blah, 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 blah. You do.
Baggage where we have fights
Mm-hmm.
within text with one another. And so you have to get into that realm of what is core about what we're studying and what are we really trying to focus on, and what is something that's maybe not so core.
Yeah.
And that's really the hard thing.
Well, and here's the thing. I have all kinds of versions. There was a while there I was going and buying gift Bibles, every version I could find. The Contemporary English, the New Century, every one I could find. Because my theory went, if I come across someone that has a Bible, am I going to say, hey, yo? I'm not going to say, hey, yo, that's weird. I can say, hey, I want to teach you about the gospel, but your Bible is broken. We need to get you a new one. Probably not the place to start. But I can have one myself that will read the same as theirs. And you can preach the gospel out of most any English version. They're getting to the point where it's getting tough, but even the loosest of them. Now, getting into more core, you said core, but more church doctrine, it starts to get very tough sometimes, especially with Paul. But to start, it's all there. I also would like to get pairs sometimes too. So if they didn't have a Bible, then we could go to the same thing, exact same, give them a page number. Because if they don't know what Romans is, how can they find it? Page numbers will match. The last thing we'll look at here, we'll just wound it out here. selecting a translation. And it's kind of getting to what Eric was talking about. And there are good reasons, and there are bad reasons. And I will offend someone. And that's okay. Good reasons. Readability. If you cannot understand what you are reading, is it going to do you any good? Now, this is a slippery slope in terms of can versus want. People need to challenge themselves. I always feel you just strive to do more and learn to do more. I just like to read in general. That's how I know things. You just read. But somewhat at a certain level, especially younger or education level, or it's just, it's an argument against King James if you can't follow the Middle English. It's not really Middle English. It's not Elizabethan. It really isn't. It's been modernized. Don't even let them fool you with that. But still, the older sounding English, if it confuses you, then it's not going to be a benefit to you. Challenge yourself. But readability, that's why you don't want to sit down and just read Young's literal all the time, because you will hurt your brain. You want it to at least flow. Translation method. This one is one of those things you have to explain to people, but it's better to have something that's trying to be a translation and not a paraphrase. Because a paraphrase is not a Bible. It's a guy's take. It's a commentary at best. Sorry. The translation method is important. This is a hard thing kind of sometimes to explain to people up front, but it's important. Familiarity. If it's something you know, it can be a reason. This gets really dangerous, though, because you don't want to be wedded to it just because you think it's the best. But there are people that all their memory work is in King James. We had teachers, their memory work is in King James, and they would teach out of the New American Standard. So we were always like, what? What are you doing? It's what they're familiar with. Informed recommendation. That's saying someone who knows what they're talking about, not the pamphlet at Mardell. Sorry, I'm not trying to beat up on Mardell, but it doesn't really give great information. Someone knows that you trust. Okay. Yep. Does I understand what you're reading? Yeah. Well, the thing is, he was reading in Greek. He knew what the words meant, but he didn't know what the purpose was. So yeah, it's there. Also, intended use. Do you want something as a study Bible, so it has maybe chain references? And this is going to come out of the other features, for lack of a better term, that are in it too. Those are things put in there by man. But cross-references, footnotes. Maybe you're going for a comparison. So you want to get maybe a newer, more dynamic equivalence version to compare with something you have, just to see how things you're doing in interlinear. Well, that's fine. Or you have a different use for it. Or you need something that someone else has. There are advantages and disadvantages to a lot of translations. The New King James, the one thing it has going for it is it's generally pretty consistent about if it chooses an English word to render a concept, it sticks with it instead of wandering to 15 others like the New American Standard does. So if you do a keyword search, it'll show up pretty well. It's pretty good about that. It also sounds a lot like the King James without these and thous. And if that's what you're used to, hey, it's based on inferior manuscripts, whatever, nerd fights. Bad reasons. Popularity. Go to Barnes & Noble and find a New American Standard. If something's popular, does that make it good? Inverse, if something's popular, does that make it bad? If it's what you have, use it. It's like the Septuagint. It was very popular because it's what they had. But popularity shouldn't be the driving force. It's like, oh, this is the new hip thing, or well, that's more fads. But this is what everybody uses, so you better conform. No, not necessarily. And there are congregations still in the church that will ask you to use a particular version. I have issue with that, but age, whether new or old. I like it because it's the old standard. I like it because it's new, which is better. Not the person, the age of the translation. You can't use the new ones, John. You're not allowed. No, the age of it. Some people. Okay, that's what I generally will use, with exception. I will go to some others occasionally. Fair enough, fair enough. But I mean, there were those that were like, the King James from 1611, which wasn't from 1611. But anyway, 1769. But anyway, it's old, so it makes it's old timey. It's religiously. Well, you might as well go back and use like the Vulgate, or well, no, that's in Latin. You might as well just learn the Greek. That's really old. Best source. Or new. And hating on something because it's new. When the ESV came out in 2001, immediately was castigated because it's a new translation. And Crossway, when they put it out, they did the innovative thing in 2001 where you bought that and then it came in black or black. If you wanted it, they had one style. They had a thin line after a while. But inside, under the top cover, they had a CD-ROM with a free version of that Bible in electronic form, which was earth-shattering in 2001. It's pretty common now. People got on about that. This newfangled technology, it's brand new. That made it evil. No, I prefer it over the NIV in terms of an easy to read. Got rid of italics, which bugs me, but that's a whole other issue. Fads. You like the cover design. Really? Special themes. They make, you go to Barnes & Noble, Mardel has these, but Barnes & Noble's big on putting out the Bible for men, Bible for women, Bible for men who like fishing, Bible for men who are in the army, Bible for, they're themed to the nth degree, and it's like, that's great, but what can you theme in there? What is going to be included that's going to be themed? It's going to be the commentary and the notes, not the text. Can that be helpful? Maybe, but that's probably not a driving reason for why you got that thing. And then there are various fads that come along. There are comic book adaptation Bibles. I have one in there. It's in a 2-thing set. It's a comic style with a bunch of pictures. It's the Lego Bible. Someone just set up Lego figurines in biblical scenarios to the entire thing. I thought it was insane, so I have it. I'm not going to go up and teach out of it. It's there. It's a thing. It's pretty wild. I don't remember what the underlying text they're using is, though. Might just be King James. Because if you publish something, you typically want to use a King James and ASV get used a lot because guess what? They're free use. You don't have to pay for it. Lockman, you got to pay him money. I'm pushing it just with our slides, but I'm allowed free use within a certain limit. Anyway. Or an uninformed recommendation, meaning basically someone doesn't know what they're talking about. That should go without saying. You should use this because I want you to. Well, no, that's not it. I think I've kind of laid out the idea of there are different underlying approaches. Some are better, some are worse. There's no perfect translation, but there are some that are better than not. Because it comes down to, do you really want to know what the original writers were trying to tell you? Or do you want to know what someone wants to tell you the original writers were trying to tell you? This is maybe the way to put it. And don't be afraid to challenge yourself, and don't be afraid to use multiples. If you can find it, software has made this so awesome with just being able to line them up with interlinears, but they publish interlinear Bibles with multiples in there. I suggest that too. Just because I use one primarily doesn't mean it's the only one I do, especially when studying. And yeah, so that kind of sets the stage for the last couple, which we're going to have to wait till September to get into with the way the schedule works, but it's going to be English translations part 1 and 2. We're going to give kind of background of all of them. I can beat up on some translations, probably hurt a lot of feelings. Spoilers, I'm going to beat up on all of them a little. But any thoughts at this point? Again, this, like I said, this is the subjective part of the study. Okay, Dawn, then Doyle. Well, it's going to depend on what they mean by that. It's like a catch-all term, okay? Some are, like I said, they're focused on a particular audience. So men, women, firefighters, lovers of DC Comics. That's a stretch, but that's some of them. That's more commentary-oriented. Some of them, though, it comes down to the way they arrange the text or some of the tools that are in there. Some study Bibles, like keyword study Bibles, will highlight certain words with keys, like Strong's keys, and that's very useful because it's in the text and it's like, oh, it's drawing attention to something. They have some that will use singular line versus dual line or have note spaces. It comes down to tools that are presented for your use. Is it getting in the way of the text? Is it trying to offer you something more than the text? Or is it giving you the tools to understand the text is going to be the difference? But that term is used so loosely that, like a Thompson's chain reference is a good study Bible. Others, it's up there. There's some cool ones out there, though. Technically, a red letter Bible that most are is a study aid. It's not in the original text. That was done by Jefferson, I think? Thomas Jefferson? I specifically, and this was a big thing at school, we specifically went and purchased Bibles that didn't have red letter. Because we didn't want even that to get in the way of us when we're looking at the text. It's obvious it's Jesus speaking, but we didn't want that filter given to us. And it was because we were trying to remove everything we could to get it. Then we start to add the tools back once we've done our study. It's about minimizing, actually. So it all depends on what you're doing. Yeah. Doyle? Well, I got some depressing news if you're talking about languages. Unless you are speaking English or German, you are going to be hard-pressed to find a Bible in your language more than maybe 5 or 6, if you're lucky. German historically has a lot because that's where the Reformation movement began. English, because it's the lingua franca and so forth. But we have a dearth of English Bibles. Spanish has like 3. Some languages don't have one. And most of them in the world are either put together by missionaries or they'll have one. So you don't tend to have this problem as much. You tend to be fighting with a bad translation, but it's the only one you got. You understand what I'm saying? India probably has quite a few, only because there are so many there. But it's still going to come down to using what they have and probably fixing a lot of issues with the translations. In Africa, it's all going to depend on the countries. A lot of the languages there are colonial or pidgin forms. So you can start with something, but sometimes you got to find a bridge. We had some missionaries that were in Vanuatu, which is the former Solomon Islands. And there was kind of a pidgin Spanish, pidgin kind of mix that you could kind of communicate with, but they ended up having to do a lot of the translating themselves from what they had to just communicate. Like I said, this big thing I'm discussing is more of a first world problem that we have. In Spanish, for instance, you'd think there would be a bunch. There really aren't, and they're heavily Catholic influenced. The Santa Biblia is heavily Catholic influenced. So I wish I could tell you that they face the same problems for different reasons, but the reality is there aren't that many in other languages, and most of them are pretty terrible. Mm-hmm. Or support from back to do translation work. Yeah, they're going to have to start from square one, which is a curse and a blessing because you're not going to have any translators in your way. So, but that's kind of the reality of where most are. There are a lot of languages that don't have anything. Mm-hmm. And they have to be bothered to learn the language instead of relying upon a local to do the work. It's a lot of work, but that's where we're at. So, any other thoughts? Certainly. Is there anyone that needs the Lord's Supper this evening? I think so. Okay. So are we ready to close, I suppose? Okay. Well, if so, Chris, would you close us in prayer?